In a recent video, I built a planter box, and in that project, I mentioned that the wood came from my very first woodworking project that I did, which was a treehouse back in 2015. And I got a ton of comments about the treehouse in the comment section. Dude Sawdust said that we demand a full in-depth YouTube review of the treehouse. So that's what we're going to do today. I want to take you on the journey of how we turn this into a dream home up in the trees, which led to me finding my passion for woodworking and also led to me finding my now wife. So stay tuned and let's get after it. As a quick scene set before I get into this, I just want to reiterate that before I built the treehouse, I had never built anything in my life, and I had no idea how to use power equipment or anything. So in 2015, when my wife and I finished up the latest season of Game of Thrones, we started channel surfing looking for something new to watch. And we stumbled across a show on Animal Planet called Treehouse Masters, which is hosted by a real nice guy named Pete Nelson. He's got an interesting background. He used to build customized homes, and somehow that morphed into his childhood dream of building houses up in the trees. Anyway, his story inspired us to start thinking about building our own treehouse, and we ended up talking ourselves into it. But along the way, I bought a book called Being a Treehouse that Pete Nelson had written, and it talks about some of the design principles and things you have to consider. And if you look closely in one of my end pictures, you can actually see I've got a copy of that on our coffee table in our treehouse. So shortly thereafter, we took a trip to our family's ranch in Central Texas, scouting for a location to build a treehouse. You need trees that are of decent size so that you can put treehouse attachment bolts in them, and they have to be far enough apart that you can fit a treehouse, but not too far apart because then the beams get too big. And we finally found an ideal location that was going to be the site of our treehouse. So we cleared out the underbrush, took some measurements, and I got to designing. Before I go through the design, I want to introduce 3 engineering considerations which fundamentally make building a treehouse different from a normal structure. The first is that trees move independently from one another, which might sound obvious, but if you think about how loads are transferred, a static structure that's built on pylons behaves very differently from a dynamic structure where you've got trees that are moving towards each other or away from each other. If you think about a tree, you've got a fixed base, which can be considered a fulcrum. You've got an applied force at the canopy, and then you've got the trunk itself. And so it basically becomes a big lever. And whenever those forces are applied in your structure, the forces of the tree are going to win over your construction lumber if given enough time. So your structure has to allow that stress to be relieved through movement as opposed to trying to overcome the stress. So rather than having 2 fixed points that you see on this drawing, we go with a fixed point on one end, which you see here through a treehouse attachment bolt, but the other end has an oval shape that allows the beam to move laterally side to side just ever so slightly. You see another picture of it here. That allows that stress to be relieved from the system, which also makes the entire platform dynamic. So on a windy day, the entire treehouse actually moves side to side, maybe an inch or 2, but all that gets dissipated through movement instead of stress within your system. The second principle relates to how trees grow. Tree trunks grow radially outward, which you have to account for, but the only length changes occur at the extremities of the tree. This is important to understand because if you are trying to place a fixed ledge or bolt inside of a tree in the trunk, you have to understand that those vertical positions are never going to change. Once they're fixed, they're not going to move, assuming the tree stays healthy. So you see here, where those beams are currently located, that'll never change. The last principle is that you don't want to attach anything directly to the tree. Nailing something, screwing something directly to the tree. Instead, you want to use treehouse attachment bolts, which I'll go through and just a moment, but in principle, they behave as a second limb of the tree. Once you install the treehouse attachment bolt, which you see pictured here, the tree will send sap to that area, and over time, it becomes like another limb of the tree. And more importantly, it does not impede the growth of the tree. As treehouse builders, we want to make sure that we take care of the tree and don't do anything to harm the tree over the long period of time. The anatomy of a treehouse attachment bolt, or tab, is broken into three parts. There's a threaded section that goes into the heart of the tree. There's a larger diameter section in the middle. This is important because that takes most of the vertical load, and the larger diameter helps spread that force out over a larger area so you don't shear through the tree. And then the last part, the perch, is where your beams rest. So in total, this treehouse had 8 tabs that were used, 4 for the treehouse and 4 for the viewing deck. With those engineering considerations out of the way, let's get straight into the design. The first thing is you have to select a location that has suitable trees. The trees have to be old enough and big enough to be able to handle treehouse attachment bolts. So you're looking for trees with a radius of about 15 inches at the minimum and bigger. You also want to make sure that the trees are healthy. Once you've got your trees selected, you also want to make sure that they're not too far apart because that makes your beam sizes very tall. So the location that we found, we're using a total of 6 trees in the design. So I went out and I took measurements of the radius of each of the trees, numbered them, and then took distances between them. Once I had that, I was able to number each of the trees and begin working on a design that would fit this space. So you really have to tailor the design of the treehouse to the trees that you've got. I first started sketching out some design on paper, but I quickly realized that if I was going to do any kind of design iterations, I'd really need to get into a CAD software. So I switched to a computer-aided design software and started mapping out where the trees were going to be and then where the beams were going to be located. Once I had the beams located, then I started to map out where were the floor joists going to go. And this was going to set the footprint of the treehouse and was also going to dictate the size of the building that I could put on the treehouse. On the left-hand side, you see the footprint for the treehouse, and on the right-hand side, you see where the viewing deck was going to go. Once you have the basic footprint, you can then start working on a floor plan. Now, I wanted to have a seating area for social engagements down on the bottom floor. We wanted space for a mini fridge and some cabinets and a coffee table and some couches. We really wanted the bottom floor of the treehouse to be more of a social space and then have the upstairs be big enough to have a queen-size bed where we could sleep. Now, here's where I would like to give a shout out to Pete Nelson and his crew, because as I was going through the design process, I had reached out to his team and I verified my designs to see if I was doing anything that was just wildly wrong. And I also had their structural engineer on staff verify my beam calculations, because while I am a mechanical engineer by background, I hadn't done those kind of structural calculations in quite some time. So Pete Nelson and his crew really helped out and gave me the bit of confidence that we needed to get started. Now you're seeing here some framing schedules and some deck rail designs. A lot of this was created in advance of ordering the materials so that we could get a accurate inventory for how much wood we needed to order, given that the lumber was being bought lump sum ahead of the project starting because it was being delivered by an 18-wheeler. So the planning in advance really helped with our materials management as we were going through this project. With the designs finalized and the calculations verified, we began to order the lumber and begin the installation of the treehouse attachment bolts. Now, this is going to be more like a slideshow because I don't have a lot of video footage. In fact, this is the only clip I have of the entire build where we're drilling the holes for the treehouse attachment bolts. But part of the negotiation with the lumber yard was that they agreed to use their 3-wheeled buggy to help lift these beams onto the treehouse attachment bolts. Each of these beams weighed about 600 pounds, so their forklift operator was just a wizard on this three-wheel buggy that helped us get these beams into place. So, big thank you to the lumber yard that helped us get that done. Once the beams were in place, then we were able to start running the floor joists and start to develop the base of both the viewing deck and the actual treehouse. So again, the treehouse is on the left, and the viewing deck is just a little bit higher on the other side. The floor joists were run just like normal residential construction. I believe that we used 24 inches on center for the floor joist. Residential, you might do 16 inches on center. But we did add insulation in the subfloor, given that you've got so much of the treehouse exposed to heat transfer on the underside. I do want to make a mention here that even though I'm going to use the word I a lot, my now wife, who you see here in blue, a lot of my friends, and particularly my father in law, pitched in a lot over the course of 12 weekends to make this a reality. So that's how long it took. The process of building this from start to finish was 12 consecutive weekends. My wife and I would work during the week, and then we'd get in the truck, go out to the ranch for the weekend, work all day Saturday, most of the day Sunday, then drive back to our home and work the next work week. So that was our life for the better part of 3 months. The framing of the house actually went together really quickly, and it's almost misleading how quickly things start to come together. The stairs were interesting because you had the platform, which was dynamic, the viewing deck is dynamic, and then the landing pad for the stair stringers was static. So that was a little bit of an engineering marvel in itself. I'd spent a lot of time on the design of the stairs because I'd never built stairs before. There's definitely a science to it. And once you figure out the science, you can, get it figured out pretty easily. But you want the first step's height to be the same as the last step's height. We were able to get that done. Once the framing of the home was complete, our next challenge was to get the house dried in and moisture proof. So we wrapped it in Tyvek just like you would a normal home, providing a moisture barrier, and started to make the rough openings prepared for the windows and doors that were going to be installed shortly thereafter. This was a pretty big milestone for us because we built this in a season where it's prone to rain quite a bit. So getting the treehouse dried in was a really, really big milestone for us. And thankfully, we were able to get it dried in within a single weekend. You may also notice that this is not an OSHA approved work site because we don't have any railings, or at least we didn't for the majority of the construction. But that was one of the last things that we added to the treehouse as part of a safety feature. The style that we went with was called hog panel fencing. So you've got a wooden frame, and in the center, you've got some wire grid mesh that allows you to see through it and provides a really nice contrast. Now, I want to pause here for a little bit to draw attention to the fact that we did have a certified electrician wire the home for electricity. And this is also one of the only pictures of the inside before the siding and the insulation went on. So I just wanted to point that out. We also had a split AC system installed, and my cousin, who did refrigeration for the Navy, was kind enough to help install that. This was the inside of the treehouse. Once we had the cedar installed, but you can still see some insulation in the rafters where we hadn't quite put the drywall ceiling on yet. But you can see it starting to come together. We did quite a bit of trim work in a very short period of time, so I didn't get a whole lot of footage of it. But once we had the siding on, then we were able to start installing some of the cabinetry and the shelving. We got the drywall installed on the ceilings, and with the electrical work complete as well, it was nice to have power and light within the treehouse. What's interesting is that I had no idea how to do any of this stuff that I'm doing. So what I would do in preparation for the following weekend is I would do a lot of research on YouTube, getting tutorials on how to install siding, how to use a particular type of power equipment, and I would do that research, and by the time it came to that next weekend, I felt confident enough to do it in practice. I think that's a real testament to how helpful the YouTube community is and how willing people are to teach. So, after 12 straight weekends of hard work, a lot of driving, and little sleep, we were proud owners of a brand new treehouse that was up in the trees. It's been said that every journey begins with a decision to start, And I'm so thankful that when my wife and I came across this TV show and the seed was planted for us to do something great and something that was a little bit uncomfortable, we decided to take that challenge head on. And it was big credit to Pete Nelson because once we finished this project and ended up sending him pictures, he was kind enough to respond back and acknowledge that the project that we ended up getting ourselves into was probably bigger than what we had originally intended, which was very true. But looking back on it, I learned so much. I learned how to use a circular saw, a miter saw. I learned about basic construction techniques and about different types of wood and dynamic loading versus static loading on structures and trees. I mean, it was quite the educational journey, and I'm very grateful that it led to me to my passion of woodworking, which a lot of that stems from this original project. I also learned that the girl that I was dating whenever we built this treehouse was the girl that I wanted to marry. So you're looking at a very nice bottle of scotch that I picked out for my father-in-law. And on this deck, the weekend that we finished the treehouse, I asked him for permission to marry his daughter. And this is a really special bottle of scotch because it was 25 years old. And my wife at the time was 25 years old. So there was a lot of sentimental value behind it. And he said yes. And so the following weekend, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. So the following year, we got married, and I guess the rest is history, as they say. I want to thank you for sticking this out to the end. I know it was kind of a long and a little bit unusual video for me, but certainly an important part of my family history and a big part of why I have a YouTube channel today. So thank you very much. Hope you learned something from it. Hope it inspires you to go out and do something on your own. And I will see you on the next one.